If photography has felt heavier over time instead of easier, the problem usually isn't motivation or discipline, it's decision load. Sustainable photography doesn't come from doing more. It comes from asking less of yourself, especially in the beginning. This is about why fewer decisions create better work, longer careers, and a photography practice you can actually live with. Most people assume photography gets easier the longer you do it. You gain experience, you understand your camera, you've seen more situations. So when photography starts to feel heavier instead of lighter, people panic. They assume something is wrong with them. They think they've lost motivation or creativity or discipline. But most of the time, the issue isn't motivation at all, it's accumulation. Photography gets heavier because decisions accumulate faster than clarity. Early on, there are fewer choices, fewer lenses, fewer styles, fewer expectations. You don't know enough yet to be overwhelmed. As time goes on, you learn more, and learning more creates options. Options sound empowering, but too many options create pressure. Pressure creates fatigue, and fatigue is often mistaken for burnout. What actually burns people out is not effort, it's sustained decision load. Every shoot asks questions: what lens should I use? How should this look? What would make this better? Am I doing this right? Early on, those questions feel exciting. Later, they start to feel heavy because they never stop. Photography doesn't remove decisions as you improve, it adds them. More techniques, more styles, more tools, more opinions. And unless something else changes, all of those decisions stack. This is why people often feel more exhausted after years of photography than they did at the beginning. Not because they're worse, because they're carrying more. Another thing that changes over time is expectation. Early on, expectations are low. You're learning, you're experimenting, you're allowed to be bad. As skill grows, expectations rise from others, from clients, from yourself. You're no longer just taking photos, you're producing work. That shift adds weight. Not because production is bad, but because it introduces judgment. Judgment multiplies decisions. Every choice now feels consequential. Every shoot feels like it has something to prove. Another factor is comparison. As you grow, you see more work, better work, more refined work, and instead of inspiring you, it sometimes overwhelms you. You start asking questions you didn't ask before. Should my work look like this? Am I behind? Should I be doing more? Those questions don't improve the photograph, they drain energy. Another thing that increases decision load over time is expansion. You add services, you add genres, you add platforms. Each edition adds choices, not just creatively, but mentally. How should I show up here? What should I post? What's working best? That constant evaluation taxes the nervous system. Another subtle contributor is responsibility. Photography stops being just for you, it's for clients, for students, for audiences. Responsibility changes how decisions feel, mistakes feel heavier, uncertainty feels riskier. You don't just make decisions, you manage consequences. Another thing that adds to decision load is the illusion of optimization. There's always a way to improve, a better setting, a better workflow, a better system. Optimization never ends, and without boundaries, it consumes attention. This is where many photographers unknowingly cross into unsustainable territory. They don't stop enjoying photography. They stop being able to rest inside it. Photography becomes something that's always asking, always demanding refinement, always requiring attention. That constant demand is exhausting. Another important thing to understand is that burnout rarely arrives suddenly. It builds quietly. You start dreading small decisions. You procrastinate shoots. You feel resistant for no obvious reason. You might still love photography, but it feels harder to begin. That resistance is not laziness, it's fatigue. Another mistake people make is trying to fix this with motivation. They tell themselves to push harder, to be more disciplined, to recommit. But discipline doesn't reduce decision load, it just asks you to endure it longer. Eventually, endurance fails. Another common response is adding structure, more planning, more systems, more goals. Structure can help, but when it adds decisions instead of removing them, it backfires. Not all structure is supportive. Some structure increases pressure. Another misconception is that sustainability comes from simplification alone. People think they need to strip photography down, shoot less, care less, want less. But sustainability is not about caring less. It's about caring selectively. You don't need to eliminate passion, you need to protect it. Another important thing to name is that decision fatigue is not a personal flaw, it's a cognitive reality. Your brain can only make so many meaningful decisions before performance drops. Photography asks for constant judgment. Without relief, judgment becomes stressful. Stress narrows attention. Narrowed attention reduces creativity. Another thing that happens over time is that photographers stop trusting defaults. They second guess everything, they abandon systems they built, they chase novelty. That restarts decision making from scratch. Defaults exist to reduce cognitive load. When they're constantly changed, fatigue increases. Another issue is that photographers often mistake flexibility for freedom. They want infinite options. Infinite options feel empowering, but freedom without constraints creates anxiety. Constraints make creativity manageable. Another contributor to burnout is the pressure to keep improving. Improvement is good, but constant improvement without rest creates instability. You're always evaluating, always adjusting, never settling. That prevents confidence from consolidating. Another thing that increases decision load is context switching, switching between shooting, editing, posting, teaching, and planning. Each role has different decision demands. Without boundaries, those demands overlap. That overlap drains energy. Another subtle factor is emotional labor. Photography involves people. Managing emotions, creating comfort, reading energy. That work is invisible but taxing. Decision fatigue compounds emotional fatigue. Another thing to recognize is that sustainability changes across seasons. What feels manageable at one point may feel heavy later. That doesn't mean you failed. It means your capacity changed. Ignoring capacity accelerates burnout. Another thing that happens is that photographers stop listening to resistance. They push through it. Resistance is information. It tells you something is misaligned. Ignoring it increases strain. Another misconception is that burnout means you should quit. Often it means you need fewer decisions, not fewer photos, not fewer goals, fewer decisions competing for attention. This is where the core idea of sustainability comes in. Sustainable photography does not ask you to do more efficiently, it asks you to decide less often, to remove unnecessary choices, to rely on defaults, to clarify priorities. That shift changes everything. When decisions are reduced, energy returns, not because photography became easier, but because your brain isn't managing unnecessary complexity. Another thing that happens when decision load drops is that confidence stabilizes. You're not constantly questioning yourself, you're executing within known parameters. That stability supports creativity. Another thing that happens is that photography becomes easier to return to after breaks because there's less to reconstruct, less to remember, less to manage. Another important point is that reducing decisions does not reduce seriousness, it increases sustainability. Sustainability is what allows seriousness to last. Another misconception is that fewer decisions mean rigidity. In reality, it creates flexibility. When fewer things demand attention, you can respond more fully to what matters. Another thing to understand is that decision reduction is an ongoing practice, not a one-time fix. As life changes, decision load needs adjusting. That responsiveness keeps photography compatible with real life. Another important shift is recognizing that sustainability is not about willpower. It's about design, designing systems that support capacity, designing defaults that reduce friction, designing learning paths that don't overload. Another thing to name is that sustainable photography feels different. It feels quieter, less urgent, less dramatic. That quiet can feel unfamiliar at first, but it's a sign of regulation. Regulated practices last. Another thing that sustainable photographers understand is that burnout is not a failure, it's feedback. It tells you the structure is asking too much. Listening to that feedback allows you to adjust. Another final point for this section is this: photography doesn't need to be constantly optimized to be meaningful. It needs to be sustainable. And sustainability begins when you stop asking yourself to manage everything at once. Before we go any further, this is the moment to pause, because when people hear fewer decisions, their instinct is to turn it into a task. They want a list, they want rules, they want to know what to cut. That reaction makes sense, but it also recreates the same pressure that caused the problem in the first place. So let's slow down. Sustainability is not about becoming more disciplined. It's about becoming more selective. It's about recognizing which decisions actually shape your photography and which ones quietly drain you without giving much back. Here's the reframe that matters: sustainable photography is not about doing less, it's about deciding less. Those are not the same thing. You can be deeply engaged and still overwhelmed. You can care intensely and still be exhausted. What changes is not effort, it's decision load. Every decision costs energy. Some decisions are worth that cost, others aren't. But without clarity, they all feel equally important. That's where fatigue comes from. Most photographers never pause to rank their decisions. They assume everything matters, so everything becomes heavy. Let's name a hard truth: many of the decisions photographers stress over do not meaningfully change the photograph. They change how the photographer feels about the photograph. That distinction matters. Feeling better is not the same as making better work. And when emotional relief is mistaken for improvement, decision making spirals. Another major drain is identity based decision making. Questions like: is this my style? Does this look like me? Am I doing photography right? Those questions feel important, but when asked too often, they exhaust you. Identity forms through repetition, not deliberation. Sustainable photographers let identity emerge, they don't force it. Another heavy category is future-oriented decision-making. Will this help me later? Is this setting me up correctly? What will this mean long term? Those questions feel responsible, but when they're asked constantly, they pull attention away from the present. You can't shoot well while forecasting your future. Sustainable photographers limit future thinking during active work. They revisit it later. Another major source of fatigue is comparative decision making. Decisions shaped by what others are doing. Should I be doing this too? Am I behind? Do I need to add this? Comparison creates reactive decisions. Reactive decisions rarely align with your actual needs. They multiply quickly. Another drain is aesthetic overdecision. Trying to finalize style, mood, and polish before foundations are stable. That feels productive, but it often delays growth. Sustainable photographers allow aesthetics to lag behind consistency. They let repetition do the work. Another exhausting category is equipment optimization, not learning your gear, but constantly evaluating whether something else would be better. That loop never ends. There will always be another option. Sustainable photographers choose their tools intentionally, then stop thinking about them. Another subtle drain is overplanning, trying to anticipate every outcome, trying to control every variable. That urge often comes from fear: fear of wasting time, fear of doing it wrong. Overplanning increases decision load before you even start. Sustainable photographers plan just enough, then they act. Another thing to pause on is this: if photography has felt heavy, ask yourself honestly, how many decisions am I making that don't change the outcome much? How many are about control instead of clarity? You don't need to answer perfectly, just notice. Awareness is the first reduction. Now let's talk about the decisions that do matter, because some decisions deserve your attention, and when you focus there, everything else becomes easier. The first category that matters is defaults. default settings, default lenses, default workflows. Defaults reduce friction, they free attention, they allow you to focus on seeing instead of managing. Photographers without defaults decide everything from scratch every time. That's exhausting. Sustainable photographers build defaults deliberately and trust them. Another important category is timing decisions: when to shoot, when to stop, when to rest. These decisions affect energy more than technique ever will. Pushing past fatigue doesn't produce better work, it produces resentment. Sustainable photographers protect timing, they stop before depletion. Another category that matters is environment: where you shoot, under what conditions, with how much complexity. Sustainable photographers reduce variables whenever possible. They don't seek chaos as a test of skill. They build skill in controlled conditions first, then expand. Another crucial category is learning sequence: what you're focusing on right now and what you are intentionally not focusing on. This matters more than people realize. Without not now decisions, everything feels urgent. Learning sequence gives your brain permission to ignore noise. That permission is relieving. Another category that matters is emotional boundaries: who you show work to, when you show it, what feedback you take in. Not all feedback is helpful at every stage. Sustainable photographers are selective, they protect fragile learning phases. That's not avoidance, it's care. Another important category is closure: knowing when something is done, when to stop editing, when to move on. Open loops keep decisions active, closed loops free energy. Sustainable photographers close loops intentionally. Another category that matters is scope: how many projects you're carrying, how many goals are active, how much you're trying to do at once. Scope creep is one of the fastest ways to exhaust creative energy. Sustainable photographers limit scope aggressively. They choose depth over breadth. Another important decision area is identity timing: when to define yourself, when to stay fluid. Locking identity too early adds pressure. Sustainable photographers allow identity to solidify slowly. Another important reframe is this: reducing decisions does not make you less serious, it makes you more effective. When fewer things compete for attention, the important things improve. This is why people often experience growth after simplifying, not because they learned something new, but because they removed interference. Another thing to understand is that decision reduction is not permanent, it's contextual. You may simplify heavily during learning phases, then reintroduce complexity later. Sustainability is dynamic. Another thing to name is that reducing decisions can feel uncomfortable because it means letting go of control. Control feels safe. Even when it's exhausting, letting go feels risky. But the risk is smaller than it feels. The reward is energy. Another helpful practice is naming what you're not deciding right now. I'm not worrying about style. I'm not optimizing gear. I'm not chasing consistency. Those statements remove pressure. They are boundaries. Another important thing is that decision reduction protects curiosity. Curiosity needs space. Decision overload crowds it out. Another benefit is resilience. When fewer decisions are active, mistakes feel smaller, recoverable. That keeps people engaged. Another benefit is returnability. Photography becomes easier to resume after breaks, less to rebuild, less to remember. Another thing decision reduction teaches is discernment. You learn what matters and what doesn't. That discernment grows over time. Another thing that happens is your relationship with photography softens. It stops demanding so much from you. That softness is not disengagement, it's regulation. Another thing to remember is that sustainability is maintained through adjustment. Decision load creeps back, and when it does, you simplify again. Another important reminder is this: if photography has felt heavy, it's rarely because you're doing too little. It's because you're carrying too much, too many expectations, too many simultaneous goals, too many decisions that don't deserve your energy. Reducing decisions is not quitting, it's choosing to stay. It's choosing a version of photography that fits into a real life. That choice is not smaller, it's wiser. There's a moment that happens when photography becomes sustainable. It doesn't announce itself, it doesn't feel dramatic, it feels quieter. Photography stops demanding so much from you. Not because you care less, but because you're no longer negotiating with it constantly. That quiet can feel strange at first, especially if you're used to photography feeling intense, urgent, heavy with expectation. But that quiet is not disengagement, it's regulation. And regulation is what allows people to stay. Most photographers who burn out don't burn out because they stop loving photography. They burn out because photography stops fitting into their life. It asks for more than they can give: more time, more energy, more emotional bandwidth. Sustainable photography is not about shrinking the work, it's about reshaping how it lives alongside everything else. When decision load drops, photography becomes easier to return to, not easier to do perfectly, easier to begin. And beginning is the hardest part. Another thing that changes when sustainability is in place is how you relate to momentum. Momentum stops feeling fragile. You no longer believe that if you pause, everything will fall apart. You trust that you can step away and come back. That trust matters because fear of losing momentum keeps people pushing past capacity. Pushing past capacity leads to burnout. Sustainable photographers understand that momentum is cyclical. It rises, it falls, it returns. They don't panic when it dips. They don't interpret it as failure. They let it move. Another shift is that photography stops needing constant justification. You don't have to prove it's worth your time. You don't have to extract value from every session. Photography becomes allowed to exist without explanation. That permission is important because practices that require justification don't last. Another thing that changes is how breaks feel. Breaks stop feeling like quitting, they feel like pauses, intentional ones. You don't lose your place, you don't start from zero, you resume. That sense of continuity is one of the strongest indicators of sustainability. If you can pause without fear, you can stay long term. Another shift is that identity loosens. You don't need to constantly prove that you're a photographer. You don't need to perform competence. You practice, and that's enough. Identity grows from repetition, not validation. Another thing that changes is how you respond to imperfect sessions. You don't spiral. You don't catastrophize. You don't assume decline. You see them as information. You adjust. You move on. That resilience doesn't come from toughness, it comes from stability. Stability comes from fewer decisions. Another subtle shift is that photography stops competing with the rest of your life. It integrates, it adapts to limited time, to low energy days, to changing priorities. Sustainable photography does not require ideal conditions, it works within real ones. Another important shift is how you interpret improvement. Improvement stops being constant, it becomes uneven. Some skills move faster, others lag. You don't force balance. You let learning be lopsided. That patience prevents burnout. Another thing that changes is that photography becomes less performative. You're not constantly thinking about how it will be received. You're present. Presence improves work more than pressure ever could. Another important aspect of sustainability is learning how to end sessions well. Not exhausted, not resentful, but okay. Stopping before depletion teaches your nervous system that photography is safe. Safe practices last. Another thing that changes is that excitement is no longer the metric. Sometimes photography feels exciting, sometimes it feels focused, sometimes it feels calm. All of those are valid. You stop expecting constant enthusiasm. That expectation is exhausting. Another shift is that you stop catastrophizing slow periods. You don't assume stagnation. You understand that integration takes time, invisible time. That time is not wasted, it's necessary. Another important thing is that sustainable photography allows for evolution without crisis. You don't need to burn everything down to change direction. You adjust gradually. That gentleness preserves energy. Another thing that changes is that photography becomes steadier, not flashy, but reliable. And reliability is what builds bodies of work. Bodies of work matter more than bursts of brilliance. Another important part of sustainability is recognizing when simplification is needed again. Decision load creeps back, new goals, new tools, new expectations. Sustainable photographers notice that creep, and instead of pushing harder, they simplify again. They prune. That maintenance is ongoing. Another important thing to name is that sustainability does not mean small ambition. It means long ambition. It's choosing a pace that allows work to mature instead of burning bright and burning out. Another shift is that photography becomes less fragile. One bad shoot doesn't threaten your identity. One dry spell doesn't undo progress. You trust the arc. That trust is built through staying. Another thing that sustainable photographers understand is that clarity is kinder than choice. Choice feels empowering, clarity feels grounding, and grounding is where learning happens best. Another important part of sustainability is emotional permission. Permission to be tired, permission to be slow, permission to be inconsistent sometimes. That permission removes shame. Shame kills engagement. Another thing that changes is that photography becomes more honest. You stop chasing what looks impressive. You respond to what matters. That honesty deepens the work. Another thing to name is that sustainable photography leaves room for joy to return unexpectedly, not scheduled, not forced, just present. Joy needs space. Decision overload crowds it out. Another important piece is recognizing that sustainability is not something you earn, it's something you design. You design it by reducing unnecessary decisions, by choosing defaults, by respecting capacity, by letting go of constant optimization. Another shift is that you stop measuring yourself against imaginary standards. You measure yourself against your ability to return. Return is the metric that matters. Another thing that sustainable photographers learn is how to say no. No to unnecessary complexity. No to pressure that doesn't align. No to doing everything. Those no's protect yes. Another thing that changes is that photography becomes less about discipline and more about care. Care for your energy, care for your attention, care for your nervous system. Care sustains practices. Discipline alone does not. Another important thing is recognizing that photography is learned in layers, not leaps. Layers require time, they require patience, they require return. Another thing that helps is compassion for your past self, for confusion, for burnout, for starting and stopping. Compassion prevents repetition. Another thing to name is that sustainable photography allows photography to remain a choice, not an obligation. Choice keeps curiosity alive, obligation kills it. Another important shift is that photography stops being a test of worth. It becomes a practice again. Practices are forgiving. They allow return. Another thing that sustainable photographers understand is that simplicity is not a phase. It's a strategy, one you return to whenever things feel heavy. Another thing that changes is that photography becomes grounded in meaning. When noise drops, intention surfaces. You remember why you care. That remembering sustains effort. Now pause here. If photography has felt heavy, harder to maintain, or fragile, that does not mean you failed. It means the structure asked too much. Reducing decisions is not giving up. It's choosing a version of photography that can exist inside a real life. That choice is not smaller, it's wiser, and it's the choice that allows photography to stay with you over the long haul. If photography has started to feel harder to sustain, the issue is rarely motivation. It's usually decision load. Longevity comes from clarity, not pressure. On my website, there's a simple learning framework designed to reduce overwhelm and support long-term growth. It's there as a reference whenever things start to feel heavy again. You don't need to push harder to keep going. Sometimes the most sustainable choice is simply asking less of yourself.